In the mid-1990s, a proposal was made to merge two of the world's most distinguished airlines, the flag carrier of the UK, British Airways, and one of the leading firms of the United States, American Airlines, with this marriage of what were essentially the national carriers of their respective countries, leading to a major stir in the global aviation market, with legal action and corporate disputes ultimately seeing this scheme not come to pass. The potential for two carriers of such influence as British Airways and American Airlines to merge is owed to the deregulation of the respective airline markets of each nation, with the British aviation industry having been strongly stacked in favour of British Airways' nationalised predecessors, the British Overseas Airways Corporation or BOAC, and British European Airways or BEA, the former being Britain's international carrier serving the colonies of the British Empire, while BEA plied its trade on domestic routes within Britain and Europe. The essential monopoly held by BOAC and BEA gained severe scrutiny from other prospective startup carriers such as Dan Air, Laker Airways and British Caledonian, which gradually saw the power of these two monoliths eroded throughout the 1960s, culminating in their merger to form British Airways in 1974 and the eventual privatisation of the firm in 1986 under the government of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. In the United States, regulation of the airline industry had begun in 1938 under the Civil Aeronautics Board or CAB, which was devised by Congress as a means of protecting the fledgling industry from excessive competition, while also maintaining a certain level of rivalry to promote efficiency, with CAB overseeing airline fares, determining route structures, and regulated several other key industry features, creating a system that was noted for its exceptional protectionism that refused to allow any major carriers to fail, while at the same time stifling new startups through excessive legal costs and petty bureaucracy. The airline industry remained under this system for 40 years, when in 1978, the Carter administration sought to diminish entry barriers for new airlines and encourage price competition among rivals, culminating in the Airline Deregulation Act, which disbanded the CAB, with the authority to review airline mergers and alliances being subsequently given to the Department of Transport or DOT, later handed to the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division from January 1, 1989. With deregulation on both sides of the Atlantic, airline consolidation skyrocketed, with the 1980s seeing the overall industry witness an unprecedented growth that included 51 airline mergers and acquisitions between 1978 and 1988, with examples including Frontier and People Express joining Continental, Western merging into Delta, Northwest taking over Hughes Air West and Republic, TWA acquiring Ozark, and US Air acquiring Piedmont. Contrarily, however, deregulation brought significant financial hardship for airlines and service problems for consumers, with air corridors to smaller communities declining severely, with 260 cities in the United States losing their air service in the first year after deregulation, and 40% of the nation's airport losing service within 2 years of deregulation. While by 1980, the airline industry had suffered record losses of $280 million, which subsequently rose to $900 million by 1982, despite the additional 7 million passengers it had acquired since 1981. Despite this negative financial climate, many airlines consummated mergers during the decade following deregulation, though for many this only served to compound their problems, as carriers were often burdened with the outstanding debt of the weaker airlines they had integrated, and this became more crushing when economic stagnation occurred, such as the recessions of the mid-1980s and the 1991 global economic recession, while other issues emerged through the integration of airline practices, trading regimens, and more notably union contracts that led to severe strike action as carriers were forced together into unhappy corporate marriages. Regardless, airline mergers continued to be an effective strategy for carriers up until the start of the aforementioned 1991 global economic recession caused by the First Gulf War, where due to the burning of oil fields by the retreating armies of Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, a spike in fuel prices sent the cost of living skyrocketing and encouraged fewer passengers to fly. In the wake of this catastrophic loss of demand, many of America's most famous airlines, including Continental, Pan Am, America West, Midway, and several smaller airlines, filed for bankruptcy within months of this crucial event, with Pan Am, Midway, and Eastern Airlines ultimately liquidating their assets, though in the face of such corporate prudence amidst unfavorable economic conditions, the airline industry settled into a period of relative stability as the surviving firms sought to simply maintain their operations without making waves across the wider market. The main airline events of the early 1990s were the continued battle between larger established carriers and low-cost, low-fare startup firms, with mergers generally taking place at low level between companies that had little influence over the market, such as 1997's ValueJet Airways merger and the Western Pacific Frontier merger, with this stability being briefly rumbled in 1995 when US Air initiated talks with United Airlines and American Airlines as to a possible combination of their assets, but these talks eventually broke down due to US Air's high labor costs. Nevertheless, the possibility of a US Air alliance was enough to rekindle the airline industry's attention on consolidation, and major carriers prepared themselves for the next announcement of two large companies forming a merger, and come 1996, the airlines generated record profits while also enjoying strong stock prices, though despite this, growth prospects for these firms were few as the industry had reached maturity, meaning the prospect of consolidation was once again considered on the cards as a natural progression within the marketplace. As such, airlines sought to improve their growth by adding more hubs to their networks and increasing international alliances, but this only came with the benefit of seeing their domestic growth increase by a mere 3% per annum, while other non-economic reasons for the potential of reviving airline consolidation was that the negative experiences that many airlines had endured in the 1980s would have given an insight as to what to avoid when proposing a merger between two carriers, and it was this mindset that set the stage for what would become one of the most high-profile consolidation proposals of the airline industry, the merging of British Airways and American Airlines into a single entity. Announced on June 11, 1996, former rivals American Airlines and British Airways made public their plans for a proposed alliance between the two giants of the world's most powerful economies, with this alliance, as originally proposed, involving both airlines pooling costs and revenues, planning strategies such as route structuring and fares, feeding passengers to each other, and possibly swapping equity stakes of up to 20%. American Airlines stated that the original alliance proposal had three main elements: coordination of all passenger and cargo services that the two carriers operate between the United States and Europe, with profit sharing on alliance services, code sharing across each other's global networks wherever possible, and the establishment of a fully reciprocal worldwide frequent flyer program. The impetus for such an alliance was recognized as the need for both carriers to stay competitive in an increasingly global market, as have been exhibited with the creation of global airline alliances such as Star Alliance, oneworld, and the Qualifier groups that amalgamated many aspects of various flag carriers, and perhaps because of the widespread consequences involved with the alliance, regulatory considerations by both the United States and British governments worked to halt the completion of the merger, while resistance by rivals, arguing potential antitrust violations and other factors, served to further complicate matters at a legal level. One of the major hurdles facing the BAAA alliance was the passage of an Open Skies Pact between the United States and Britain, with the American government declaring that it would not approve the alliance unless Britain agreed to an Open Skies Pact, an agreement the United States had with up to a dozen countries at the time, as well as liberalized air transportation pacts with nearly 30 other international partners. The proposed Open Skies Treaty would provide British and American carriers unrestricted access to airport hubs, to which both airlines had stated their accord with such a policy, advocating that their proposed alliance promoted open competition and lower ticket prices, while closely tied to the issue of an Open Skies agreement was the argument raised by rival airlines that the American Airlines-British Airways alliance would stifle competition from other carriers, with American Airlines and British Airways, at the time of the merger announcement, carrying around 60% of the airline traffic between the United States and Great Britain. Thus, the alliance, if approved, would mean the pre-existing competition between the airlines would be eliminated, and thereby create, as declared by rival operators such as Virgin Atlantic and Continental Airlines, a massive transatlantic price gouging cartel, suggesting that the two largest transatlantic carriers should not be allowed to combine their operations without requiring a substantial divestiture of assets to assure genuine competition. However, the CEOs of both British Airways and American Airlines, Bob Ayling and Donald Carty, dismissed such claims that the alliance would hamper competition or fix prices, with Carty being of the opinion that the merger would still be open to undercutting in terms of price, thus meaning the combined BAAA alliance could not sustain 60% of the market indefinitely, while Ayling declared that the alliance would increase competition and lower fares. More crucial, though, was the access of the carriers to the coveted takeoff and landing slots at London Heathrow Airport, with the UK aviation authorities at the time of the proposed merger only allowing two US carriers to fly into Heathrow, American Airlines and United Airlines, with the strangling of access for other American carriers being a contentious topic between the British and US governments, with the latter insisting that Heathrow open its doors to more American companies, including Delta, Continental, Northwest, Transworld Airlines and US Airways, before allowing a merger deal between British Airways and American Airlines to be ratified. The need to satisfy the British and American governments was coupled to an additional requirement to meet the approval of the European Union, with the EU long stating that it would block the alliance if the airlines did not make concessions on slots at Heathrow, informing American Airlines and British Airways in July of 1997 that they would have to make room for other airlines by giving up 350 slots at Heathrow. While both American Airlines and British Airways continue to assure their rivals that the slots could be made available at Heathrow for other carriers, this provided little comfort to those across the industry, while the American Senate hotly debated the topic of the proposed alliance, allowing airlines such as Continental and TWA the opportunity to voice their concerns. The three primary arguments made against the merger were that it would be too large, it would dominate the Anglo-American air travel market with increased prices resultant, and even in the event of an open skies agreement being reached between the British and American governments, genuine competition would be impossible because of the slot and facility constraints at London Heathrow. American Airlines responded to each of the concerns by declaring that the American Airlines-British Airways alliance would actually be smaller than the two pre-existing corporate alliances of Star Alliance, as formed through the combination of Lufthansa, United Airlines and SAS, and the KLM Northwest Alliance, expecting that the grip of the two carriers of 61% of the market would likely fall to 41% under open skies. They also considered the matter of capacity at Heathrow Airport to be non-existent, and determined the facility not to be full, drawing emphasis to the fact that 45 new airlines have been able to secure slots at Heathrow between 1991 and 1997, and that 71 daily peak-hour slots have been added at Heathrow in the 4-year period between 1992 and 1996. In addition to the matter of antitrust laws, open skies agreements, and the capacity of Heathrow Airport, many other ancillary factors also plagued the viability of the British Airways-American Airlines merger, with some carriers, including Delta and United Airlines, deliberately dragging their feet when it came to providing information as to their operations to the European Union so as to intentionally draw out the proceedings and stall for time. At the same time, US Airways brought a lawsuit against the proposed American Airlines-British Airways alliance, claiming that the merger would breach a 1993 investment agreement that British Airways made with US Airways, in which the UK flag carrier had purchased a 24% stake in the US firm, stating that American Airlines was interfering with this investment contract and that the alliance would violate antitrust laws. In the end, a federal judge dismissed the interference allegation against American Airlines on a technicality, but reserved judgment on the antitrust claims, with the US Airways lawsuit being one of a plethora of legal challenges brought against the alliance that continued to draw out the proposed merger and generally slowed down proceedings. Eventually, the merger was called off quietly during 1997 due to a lack of agreement by the regulatory bodies overseeing the alliance of the two carriers, together with various strict conditions being implemented on the finalized deal that would have been severely damaging to both British Airways and American Airlines' place on the market should the combination of their assets have gone ahead. The most notable of these would have been the requirement to surrender a large number of slots at London Heathrow to other carriers, which would have robbed the enlarged company of an important competitive edge when seeking to dominate the lucrative transatlantic market. British Airways suffered heavily from the collapse of the proposed merger deal, as not only did the company lose a potentially dominant position on the wider market alongside American Airlines, but also saw the collapse of its $500 billion stake in US Airways that had barely been paid off, signifying a substantial loss for the firm. With this, in combination with the severely negative perception of the recently unveiled Project Utopia tail-fin scheme by CEO Bob Ayling, which heavily damaged the image of Britain's flag airline and saw much of its once loyal customer base opt to use rival carriers such as Virgin Atlantic. However, in a theoretical scenario regarding the successful merger of British Airways and American Airlines, industry analysts had considered what the impacts of this alliance would have brought to the wider commercial aviation market in terms of revenues, passenger impacts, employee influence, and the general state of the combined carrier going into the new millennium. Most analysts considered that, based on the sheer size and magnitude of merging the assets of British Airways and American Airlines, which would subsequently dominate 25% of the global airline market, the collaboration of these two marques would not encourage further consolidation between airlines, but instead see regulatory bodies work to deter similar alliances in the future, along the same lines as what was proposed by British Airways and American Airlines. This would have left a binary situation of the respective governments of both nations to either approve all merger proposals out of fair competition or refuse them so as not to see the airline industry descend into a muddled arrangement of gigantic international super airlines with highly complex overseas arrangements with their respective governments. And from a purely economic standpoint, even with the successful merger of British Airways and American Airlines, analysts predicted that the remaining airlines could stay competitive provided that they undertook their own mergers, as mooted in response to the combination of the British and American carriers should they occupy 61% of the transatlantic market. Examples of this included United Airlines, Southwest Airlines, and Alaska Airlines combining to dominate 28% of the market, Delta and Northwest Airlines combining to acquire 29% of the market, or US Airways, TWA, and America West combining to take on 15% of the market, with smaller or weaker carriers such as TWA being rooted out of the wider market, and thus resulting in a generally stronger playing field of established brands that would consolidate the industry, though all of these would depend on the ability of each carrier to align their business practices, corporate policies, and trade union agreements, often the death knell to many a combined airline in the long term, as demonstrated in the 1980s. Further benefits could also have been achieved through the demands of the regulatory bodies on both sides of the Atlantic, which demanded that under no circumstances would the British Airways and American Airlines merger go ahead without the sacrifice of vital landing slots at Heathrow, a benefit to all other rivals whether standalone or merged into various corporate alliances. Ultimately, the merger of various carriers would occur in the decades following the start of the new millennium, with a spate of consolidation occurring primarily in the United States, as legacy airlines came together in new corporate alliances, the first being the acquisition of Transworld Airlines by American Airlines in 2001, after the former's slow fiscal collapse throughout the previous 2 decades. 2008 would see Delta acquire Northwest Airlines, and America West acquire US Airways, who itself was acquired by American Airlines in 2015, while United Airlines would take over Continental Airlines in 2012, leaving essentially 3 major players in the field of legacy airlines within the American market that now vie for power over low-cost rivals such as JetBlue, Southwest Airlines, Sun Country, and Alaska Airlines. Meanwhile, in Europe, a general pattern of forming airline alliances rather than whole-scale mergers remained the order of the day, with British Airways combining its assets with Iberia in April 2010 under the holding banner of the International Airlines Group, or IAG, while KLM merged with Air France to form the KLM Air France Group, and Lufthansa took a controlling share in both Swiss International and Brussels Airlines, following the rocky revival of both Switzerland's and Belgium's flag carriers in the wake of their combined collapse during 2001. In conclusion, the potential merger of British Airways and American Airlines, in practical terms, was one essentially doomed from the start, as despite the consolidation of these 2 firms' assets into a large transatlantic operator, far too many legal and political restrictions existed that precluded the ability of these carriers to form an international alliance of the scale proposed in 1996, and had the merger successfully reached fruition, the subsequent fallout would have stripped far too much from each airline's existing facets to make the proposition one mutually beneficial to either party. In the end, though, while a merger of this design did not occur on an international level, internal American collaborations in the 2000s and 2010s, as well as pan-European alliances under holding companies and airline groups, led ultimately to the consolidation predicted by analysts should the British Airways-American Airlines merger have gone ahead in the mid-1990s, and therefore would have created an industry that has worked to root out the weaker brands, and thereby streamline operations with a range of fewer but stronger marques that now dominate the modern commercial aviation scene.